On paper, 2025 was supposed to be another hard year, another spreadsheet of suffering, another appeal, another plea for solidarity. Instead, it became something else entirely. For the first time in modern history, humanitarian aid did not merely fall short. It collapsed. While wars burned and hunger spread, the global system designed to keep people alive quietly ran out of fuel. Funding fell back to levels last seen nearly a decade ago. Millions who needed help simply didn't get it. Not because the crises disappeared, but because the money, the politics, and the will did. Here's the unsettling truth. In 2025, Americans spent more on Halloween candy than their government spent on life-saving humanitarian aid. That is not a metaphor. That is a signal. If you want to understand how we reached the worst humanitarian year on record and why this failure wasn't sudden but structural, stay with me. This story begins long before the cuts, and it leads somewhere far more dangerous than most people realize. Let's slow down and look at how the system actually broke. What made 2025 different wasn't the scale of suffering. The world has endured catastrophe before. What changed was how the humanitarian system understood itself. At the center of that system sits the United Nations annual blueprint, the Global Humanitarian Overview. Produced by UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the document is meant to answer three simple questions: who needs help, where they are, and what it would cost to keep them alive. The 2025 edition identified 189 million people in need across 42 emergencies, with a price tag of $47.4 billion. It was framed as a call for global solidarity, but behind the language was a quieter admission. The system was already stretched to its limits. Funding was no longer keeping pace with crises. Conflicts were lasting longer. Climate shocks were compounding faster, and aid workers themselves were operating under unprecedented risk. As Antonio Guterres put it, the document was an indictment of our failings as an international community. The warning signs were clear. The question was whether anyone still intended to listen. Because the real story of 2025 begins with what donors did next. To understand why that warning went unheeded, you have to step back a few years. The humanitarian system did not break overnight. It was worn down. Between 2019 and 2022, COVID-19 and Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine nearly doubled the cost of global humanitarian appeals. Governments responded with unprecedented generosity. By 2022, official humanitarian funding peaked at around $30 billion worldwide. But this surge created a fragile illusion that emergency spending could substitute for long-term political solutions. When wars in Gaza and Sudan erupted in 2023, needs rose again. This time, donors hesitated. Inflation at home, fiscal tightening, electoral pressure. Humanitarian aid, always voluntary, became easier to postpone than domestic pain. By late 2024, the pullback was already visible. Germany, the world's second-largest donor, cut billions under austerity measures. The United Kingdom never restored a $1 billion reduction made years earlier. Saudi Arabia and Japan quietly scaled back hundreds of millions more. Aid didn't disappear. It thinned, and as resources narrowed, the system began making impossible choices, deciding not how to save lives, but which lives to save first. That was the moment the crisis crossed a threshold, because one donor still mattered more than all the others combined. That donor was the United States. Even as other governments pulled back, Washington continued to shoulder nearly 40% of all global humanitarian funding. It was an uncomfortable imbalance, but it kept the system standing. Many inside the United Nations believed that if the tallest mast held, the ship would stay afloat. They were wrong. In January 2025, within days of returning to office, Donald Trump signed an executive order pausing new foreign assistance and launching a 90-day review. 4 days later, stop work orders froze existing programs. By early February, USAID's website went dark. At first, confusion reigned. Then the damage became clear. Programs didn't just slow, they ceased. Contracts unraveled. Supply chains snapped. Local partners, often the last line between life and death, were told to stand down with no timeline, no clarity, and no backup. This wasn't austerity. It was a hard stop. If this channel helps you see global crises more clearly, take a moment to follow or subscribe. What's happening here doesn't stay over there. It reshapes the world you live in. And this was only the opening shock. Because once the US stepped back, something deeper was exposed, an assumption the entire humanitarian system had quietly depended on. What was exposed wasn't just a funding gap. It was a design flaw. The humanitarian system had evolved around a dangerous premise that short-term generosity from a handful of powerful donors could indefinitely sustain a world of permanent crisis. Efficiency improved, coordination tightened, but resilience never caught up. When US funding froze, there was no reserve engine to switch on. Private finance often invoked as the future remained largely theoretical. In 2025, more than 60 governments contributed over $380 million to the UN's Central Emergency Response Fund. The private sector, just 5 contributions. The largest was $2 million, still listed as pledged. Agencies began shedding staff. Programs were narrowed to bare survival. Prevention disappeared first, then protection, then food. By 2024, acute food insecurity had already reached 295 million people worldwide. In 2025, with fewer dollars available, UN agencies were forced into triage, cutting food from the hungry to preserve supplies for the starving. This is how systems fail. Not with collapse, but with rationing. Behind every spreadsheet adjustment was a quiet recalculation of human worth. Calories reduced, clinics closed, futures deferred. And once that logic takes hold, the consequences don't stay abstract for long. They arrive suddenly, violently. The violence didn't arrive by accident. It followed the retreat. As funding dried up and programs vanished, humanitarian spaces became more dangerous, not less. In the first half of 2025 alone, more aid workers were killed than in any full year before 2023. This wasn't a spike, it was a shift. According to Humanitarian Outcomes, the pattern had changed. For decades, aid workers were most often targeted by non-state militias. In 2025, the primary threat increasingly came from state actors, the very authorities meant to uphold international humanitarian law. Nowhere was this clearer than Gaza. Since the 7th of October 2023, more than 500 humanitarian workers have been killed there. It became the deadliest operating environment for aid workers on record. Ukraine, Sudan, the Middle East. The signal was unmistakable. When states no longer feel bound to protect humanitarian access, neutrality stops working. Aid convoys become targets. Relief workers become liabilities. And the moral firewall separating war from starvation collapses. This is the moment when a humanitarian crisis turns existential. Because if the rules no longer protect those delivering aid, the entire system loses permission to operate at all. And that loss doesn't hit institutions first, it hits people. If you're wondering what all of this means in human terms, this is where it becomes personal. Because when funding collapses, it doesn't disappear evenly. It concentrates its damage on the people who have no margin left. If you are a refugee in Bangladesh's Cox's Bazar, one of more than 1.26 million Rohingya, stateless and unable to work, your survival depends entirely on food aid. In March 2025, that ration was cut in half. From $12.50 a month to $6. Enough calories to exist, not enough to grow, not enough to learn, not enough to stay healthy. If you are a child in Gaza, Sudan, South Sudan, or Yemen, those cuts don't show up as numbers. They show up as stunted growth, irreversible brain damage, hunger that permanently rewires the body. By the end of 2025, more than 1 million people were living in conditions officially classified as catastrophic or famine. Aid didn't fail because the need disappeared. It failed because the world chose not to meet it. If this story matters to you, don't scroll past it. Share it, follow it, talk about it. Because silence is how systems like this keep breaking. And the consequences don't stop at borders. What happens next is the part most people never see. Because when humanitarian aid retreats, the shock doesn't stay local. It ripples in places like Gaza, Sudan, South Sudan, and Yemen. Starvation and displacement don't just create human tragedy. They create political pressure that spills outward into neighboring states, trade routes, security alliances, and migration systems already under strain. Refugee flows accelerate. Host countries absorb shocks they didn't cause. Borders harden. Naval routes become militarized. Food markets tighten. Prices rise far from the front lines. Even moments that should have signaled recovery carried a darker edge. In Syria, more than 2.5 million people returned home after the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime, a generational opportunity to shift from emergency aid to reconstruction. And yet, in 2025, U.S. humanitarian funding to Syria fell by 63%. So the cycle reset. Return without recovery, hope without investment. This is how humanitarian failure becomes geopolitical instability, not through sudden collapse, but through accumulated neglect. Each cut narrows options. Each delay hardens positions. Each unfed child becomes tomorrow's unresolved crisis. And once the system reaches that point, the future stops being a forecast. It becomes a set of wagers. Looking ahead, there are only 3 realistic paths forward. None of them are comfortable. The first is recovery. In this scenario, governments reverse course, funding rebounds. The humanitarian system stabilizes just enough to meet rising needs. This would require political courage, especially from major donors, and a renewed belief that preventing famine is cheaper than managing chaos later. It is possible, but nothing in 2025 suggests momentum in that direction. The second path is stagnation. Aid budgets remain flat. Crises multiply. Agencies normalize permanent triage, helping the starving, abandoning the hungry. The system survives in name, but not in function. This is the most likely outcome. It demands no dramatic decisions, only inertia. The third path is breakdown. State violence against aid workers continues. Humanitarian access erodes. Donors disengage further. The distinction between war and starvation disappears. In this future, famine is no longer a failure, it is a weapon. Here's the uncomfortable insight. Humanitarian aid has always depended on politics pretending not to exist. In 2025, that pretense collapsed. What comes next depends on whether the world rebuilds solidarity or accepts hunger as a permanent feature of global order. And that choice leads us to the end of the story. By the end of 2025, the numbers told a quiet, devastating story. 25 million fewer people received aid, even though their need barely changed. Thousands of humanitarian workers lost their jobs. And for the first time this century, 2 famines were declared in a single year. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was a choice. The system didn't fail because it lacked expertise. It failed because solidarity proved optional. Humanitarian aid now faces a brutal tension. Save lives today with a system that is breaking, or pause and reform while people starve in the meantime. There is no clean solution. Only trade-offs measured in human lives. Here's the insight that matters. If states are no longer willing to fund aid, and no longer willing to protect aid workers, then humanitarianism stops being a moral commitment. It becomes a gamble. What happens in Gaza, Sudan, Yemen, or Cox's Bazar is not distant tragedy. It is a preview of a world where hunger is normalized, rules are optional, and survival depends on politics you don't control. If you want to understand where the world is heading, follow this conversation, share it, stay engaged. Because once aid collapses, rebuilding it takes more than money. It takes will,